We'll get started. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. We're really glad to see you here. The three of us have come a long way. We've come from Helena to present to you today our restoration plan for the 2015 Bridger Yellowstone River oil spill. So today we're going to give a little background on the spill, which is probably be old news for most of you. Talk a little bit about our restoration plan, and then really while we're here, talk about how you guys can participate, how we can get some public input on that restoration plan, and we'll have details about that at the end of this presentation. But before we get in too deep here, let's talk about some sort of ground rules, some general guidelines here. Just so you guys know, this meeting is being recorded. That's what I was just fiddling around with. It's recorded both audio and video, and we're also streaming this on the internet. There's several people watching online right now. And we'd ask at the end of the presentation, if you have questions or comments, please state your name so that folks online know who's talking, and also so that's documented on our recording. So just to kind of go through an outline of what we kind of want to accomplish today, we want to talk about sort of who we are as the Natural Resource Trustees. I'm Nathan Cook. I work for the Montana Natural Resource Damage Program. I'm here with Doug Martin, also from NRDP, and Brian Balmer from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We'll talk a little bit about the natural resource damage laws that provide the background for this restoration plan. We'll provide a little bit of the spill itself, the background of the impacts of the oil spill, and then we'll get into the restoration plan itself. I see some of you guys came prepared with copies of the restoration plan. We have other copies in the back if you want to look at the details as we go along. As we're talking about the restoration plan, we'll talk about the funds that are available to do restoration and recreation projects, sort of how we categorize those different restoration actions, and the alternatives of those restoration actions. And those alternatives, as I'll talk about later, are basically how we're proposing to allocate funding to different restoration categories. And then we'll talk about the trustees' preferred alternative, so our preferred alternative for allocating those funds. And finally, and probably most importantly, how you guys can participate and how you guys can comment on this plan. And then finally, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. I think we can stay here all night if we want. We have the keys, so invite your friends. So who are we and why are we here? Well, the three of us are representatives for the trustees, and the trustees, the representatives of the trustees are the Montana Natural Resource Damage Program. Again, Doug and myself work for NRDP. We also have Sydney Stewart and Catherine Haustrath online. Brian works for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We're also joined by Claire Cragen online, and there's several other folks online as well. So Mike Backus from FWP, and probably some other agency folks are there as well. And why we're here is we've been working on a restoration plan to allocate the expenditure of about $1.7 million on projects to restore the natural resources injured by the 2015 Bridger oil spill on the Yellowstone River. And we're seeking comments on our draft restoration plan at this time. After we get those public comments, we can proceed to get actually the governor's signature on that plan and start implementing projects. We'll talk more about that process later on. So who we are in terms of the Natural Resource Damage Program, our mission is to restore, rehabilitate, replace, or acquire the equivalent of injured natural resources in each of the injured areas in accordance with the restoration plans adopted by the governor. Like I said, we ultimately report to the governor. He will be the one that ultimately signs off on this restoration plan. And I just like to emphasize that these projects have to restore, rehabilitate, replace, or acquire the equivalent of those resources that were lost during the oil spill. So just as a sort of frame of reference, those are the type of projects we try to put into this plan. NRDP was established in 1990 in response to a damage claim against ARCO in the Clark Fork River Basin surrounding mining damage in the Butte and Anaconda area. We work on behalf of the governor as a natural resource trustee. We're administratively attached to the Montana Department of Justice. And we have two kind of main components. We have a recovery component that goes out and does assessment and evaluation of injuries and recovery of damages. And we'll talk about what we mean by injury and damages in just a couple of slides. So we have this recovery component where we go out and seek damages for injured natural resources. And then we have a restoration component where we use those damage funds to spend on natural resource restoration actions. And we work really closely with a lot of different partners, state partners, landowners, local officials, sporting groups, and other stakeholders and project partners to get these projects done. We couldn't really get anything done without a lot of cooperation. We currently have 13 employees. I'm going to step away for just a second and let Brian talk about Fish and Wildlife Service component here.
Sure. So at the end of these next couple of slides, you're all going to be experts in NRDP, since you're now sitting through probably the second time you've heard of this, a lot of you. But so yeah, I'm with the U.S. Department of Interior Natural Resource Damage Program. You can see kind of the similar trends here that we're seeing with Montana NRDP too as well. So focus here is to restore natural resources injured as a result of oil spills or other hazardous substances released in the environment. Other goal here is you're going to see this as a common trend. We really want to develop strong collaborations with our partners. So federal, state, tribal, get everybody on the same page for moving forward with restoration. We also negotiate legal settlements and initiate legal actions against responsible parties, joining with our state and tribal co-trustees. And then lastly, apply these settlement funds to restoring injured resources and recovering costs associated with damages studies. So specifically, what does Fish and Wildlife Service do within the Department of Interior? Well, we're really focused on evaluating and mitigating impacts of contaminants on trust resources. These are some fisheries specifically focused on threatened endangered species, as well as migratory birds and also national wildlife refuge land. And then once again, just to keep emphasizing this, our real big purpose here is really developing a strong collaborations, though. We really want all partners involved to be part of this process. And now for folks that have sat through this twice now, you're going to be really experts in the NRDP process. So we're just going to go through definitions of a couple of the common themes that we're going through the rest of this presentation. So first, what is a natural resource? Well, it's land, fish, wildlife, biota, air, water, drinking water supplies, or other such resources belonging to, managed by, or held in trust by basically the United States, state, or local governments. When we use the term injury throughout this presentation, we're really talking about observable or measurable adverse change in a natural resource or impaired natural resource service. And then lastly, when Nathan's talking about damages here, we're going to be talking about a sum of money claimed or awarded in compensatory for a loss of an injury or an injury. And damages for injury to, destruction of, or loss, basically natural resources. These include reasonable costs of assessing these damages as well as looking towards restoration. This one, me?
I can take this one.
Okay.
Okay. So this slide, we're just looking at different natural resources and sort of how the state and the federal agencies sort of divide up our responsibilities for these different resources. So as a state, we focus a lot on surface water, fish, wildlife. And like I've said several times, we work as a representative of the governor of Montana. Federal resources, they tend to focus more on migratory birds and endangered species, like Brian said. And they're technically working on behalf of the Secretary of the U.S. and the Department of Interior. So this whole restoration planning project process is ultimately arises out of natural resource damage laws. And in particular with the oil spill, 2015 oil spill on the Yellowstone River, the applicable law was the Oil Pollution Act, or OPA, and you may hear me talk about that as well. NRD works often under CERCLA, which is the Federal Superfund law, or CERCA, which is the state version of the Superfund law. And we work closely with other agencies like EPA and DEQ, who are primarily the ones that are responsible for the remediation and cleanup phase of these kind of releases of hazardous substances or oil spills. So EPA and DEQ will do a cleanup action or remediation to try to clean up those substances to meet human health requirements and also improve the environment. And the goal is not to completely restore the environment, although that may be a byproduct of those remedial actions. So NRDP and Fish and Wildlife Service, in this case, we work on this restoration component. So restoration leaves where remedy has left off, where the cleanup has left off. And our goal in restoration is to restore those injured natural resources to baseline condition, to compensate for I can't read that. Compensate the public for associated interim losses. And recovered damages must be used to restore, replace, rehabilitate, or acquire the equivalent of those natural resources. So you've heard me say that a few times, but that's really important, is that these actions that we're going to take have to fit that: restore, replace, or rehabilitate, or acquire the equivalent of those resources that we lost during the oil spill. So this is a real simple diagram of what happens after a hazardous substance release. So there's the spill itself, there's a sort of immediate impact, and there's that remediation or cleanup stage. After that cleanup stage takes place, restoration can step in and try to further bring those natural resources back to that baseline condition. And we'll talk a little bit about that process as we talk about the spill itself. So you guys are probably acutely aware of all this, but just a sort of timeline of the spill back in 2015, on January 17th, there was the pipeline break. It was owned by Bridger Pipeline. By January 18th, contamination had reached City of Glendive's water treatment plant. On the 21st, cleanup efforts began, but winter weather hindered progress. So, the river was covered with ice at that time, so it was hard to actually get to the oil. Then in March, temperatures warmed up, the ice started to break up, and there's yet another release of oil from the river. And then March 22nd, EPA ended their response efforts. March 10th, DEQ ended their cleanup operations. So that was the end of the remedial, that cleanup phase that we mentioned on the last slide. And this map here on the right is just showing a general idea of where the oiling in the river occurred. Again, you guys probably. So in terms of the restoration planning process, like I said before, there's a release of the spill, and then those cleanup actions. And then for the restoration phase, there's an injury assessment. So folks go out and try to see how bad the damage actually is and to what natural resources. So in the case of the 2015 Bridger spill, there was one of the natural resources that was injured was surface water. And as part of that injury, components, chemical components characteristic of crude oil, such as benzene, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, volatile organic compounds, things like that were found in high concentrations in the surface water. And those concentrations exceeded water quality standards as well as aquatic life criteria. So criteria that are based on how critters can live and survive in those kind of conditions. And as in terms of impacts of the surface water injury, EPA issued an advisory for Glendive tap water, and bottled water was supplied to about 6,000 residents from January 18th to January 22nd. And then again, during that ice off in March, there was an additional release of oil, and the city again issued a request from residents to conserve water, and bottled water was made available again. Fish were another injured aquatic resource. They live in the river, obviously. And those high concentrations of those chemicals in the surface water, chemicals like benzene, PAHs, etc., those are above levels known to have impacts on fish like walleye, pallid sturgeon, all the fish that live in the Yellowstone River. And some of the kind of impacts that were observed from that exposure were things like tissue damage. Externally, FWP documented these kind of lesions on fish. And it's generally, these are just concentrations were known to be higher than levels that are healthy for fish populations. The other part of the damage to this fishery had to deal with elevated concentrations of some of those same chemicals, such as PAHs, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene in the fish tissue itself. So many of the fish that FWP went out there and sampled had high concentrations of these chemicals. So FWP ended up issuing a fish consumption advisory from January 21st to April 13th of 2015. So that represented, a lost recreational resource. There was lost opportunity there to go out and fish and eat these fish from the Yellowstone River. And the last injury we'll talk about is the injury to birds on the Yellowstone River. And that was primarily composed of oiled birds being observed on the river and birds using oiled parts of the river itself. And this picture is showing these birds using this oiled point bar here. And in terms of impacts, oil is known to have a variety of negative impacts on birds, such as reduced growth and survival. So that's a little background on the injuries and the assessment that was done to those injured natural resources. After that stage in the process came the settlement negotiations, and that's where things actually started rolling in terms of the restoration planning process. And the way these negotiations are sometimes focused is on these interim losses. So when there's a release of a hazardous substance, the natural resources are impacted from that baseline condition. The condition of those resources are decreased, and so there's this loss of natural resources, be it surface water, birds, fish, etc. And the response action, so that cleanup, improves the condition of those natural resources, but there's still those interim losses, and so that often serves as the baseline for damage claims. So how much should the trustees receive as a result of this loss of natural resources? So in the case of the 2015 oil spill, settlement negotiations started back in 2018, and the consent decree was finally signed in January of last year. And this is a table here showing the funds that were received as a result of that settlement. So basically a total of $2 million. Trustees received $2 million to do restoration funds. Of that $2 million, $300,000 had to go back to pay for past costs. So those were costs of the injury assessment itself and then the settlement process. So that leaves approximately $1.7 million to do available for restoration actions. And of that 1.7, it's divided mostly to the state, with about 190,000 going to Fish and Wildlife Service repairs. So after settlement negotiations were completed last year, the scoping process started. And who here was came to the public meeting last time we were here? So that was sort of the first phase in the scoping project. We were looking for ideas from the public on potential restoration projects, as well as potential impacts to implementing this restoration plan. And so we appreciate you guys for being there and participating. Like I said, we had a previous public scoping period from January to February. Earlier this year, we had the meeting right here in the same room. And as a result of that public comment period, we received 5 comments from 2 comment leaders. So our job was, once we received those comments, were those comments applicable to the laws and the policy that we have to follow when drafting a restoration plan? And if they were, we incorporated them into the plan. So, for example, we received a comment from Walleyes Unlimited that they'd like to see some improvements to the local boat ramp and river access site here in Glendive. And that we found that did fit those requirements of having restore, replace, or acquire the equivalent of natural resources. So we incorporated that right into the restoration plan. So like I said, we took those comments, we incorporated what we could into the restoration plan, and also, drafted it with the following sort of outline. So those of you who haven't seen it, it starts off with introduction and background on the spill, much of the same stuff we've been talking about so far in this presentation. And then we go on to talk about these restoration alternatives. And in that section, we talk about these restoration action categories. I'll go into detail about those, but those are basically fish, fishing, and birds. And then we talk about the restoration alternatives. So again, the alternatives are, what we mean by that is how are we going to allocate funds to those different categories? So fish, fishing, and birds. The way we evaluate those alternatives, we do it under state and federal laws, and then we select a preferred alternative. That's all in the plan right now, and it's all open for public comment, and that's what we hope to get you guys from today. And after this thing is finalized, we'll move on to the implementation phase, and the restoration plan has some details in terms of how we actually will do that. So here again are those 3 restoration action categories. First one is fish habitat restoration. So talk more about these in detail, but like I said before, we took these and we looked at basically 4 different alternatives in terms of how we're going to allocate fundings to fish, birds, and recreation or fishing. And we always, we're required to have a no action alternative. Alternative 1 is always a no action alternative where we don't do any restoration. And then the other 3 alternatives are basically, we use different proportions of that $1.7 million to those 3 different categories. More details on that to come. So the fish habitat restoration category actions would include things like increasing channel complexity, working with things like side channels, backwaters that are really important for younger life stages of fish, enhancing floodplain connectivity, improving fish passage. For example of that is FWP is looking to improve fish passage on irrigation diversion on the Tongue River. And those locations for those passage projects in particular don't necessarily need to be right in the vicinity of the oil spill to have biological benefits, because fish will swim such long ways to complete their life cycle. The project on the Tongue River can have real benefits to fish populations lower down in the Yellowstone. In terms of bird habitat restoration actions, those include things like restore inland and riparian habitats, as well as conservation easements or other restoration strategies in the broader prairie potwar region. In reality, given the funds that we have to do bird habitat restoration actions, they'll probably be focused much more locally on the Yellowstone River themselves. But there is a potential for the working in that broader biologically linked area of the prairie potwar region. In terms of recreation restoration actions, type of category of things we've included in the restoration plan include things like developing, enhancing access on public or private lands, and that Glendive Yellowstone River access site right here in town is a good example of that, as well as potentially developing a whole new fishing access site somewhere. And those type of projects we're proposing just within the area of lost use, so just the area on the Yellowstone downstream of the oil spill. So this is kind of where the rubber hits the road, the restoration alternatives. How do we allocate the funds we have to those different categories? And so these are the numbers we have proposed in the plan. So again, that alternative 1 is a no action alternative. Obviously, that's not our preferred alternative. Alternative 2 is weighted towards fish habitat, allocating roughly 1.4 million to fish habitat, 115,000 to bird habitat, and no money to recreation. Note that all of these categories include some money for administrative costs and plan development. Those are basically costs that that aren't directly related to one restoration category. And these last three alternatives all include 115,000 for bird habitat. Alternative 3 is weighted heavily towards recreation, so that 1.4 million is now going to recreation under that alternative. Still have 115,000 for bird habitat. And then alternative 4, which is the trustees' preferred alternative, is a balance between fish habitat, bird habitat, and recreation, with $890,000 allocated to fish habitat restoration, 115,000 to bird habitat, and $475,000 going to recreation. And the reason we landed on alternative 4 is it achieves the goals of the legal and policy criteria that we have to follow. It produces benefits for all the injured resources. It replaces some of the recreational services lost because of the injury. And it seems to be aligning with the priorities of the community based on the input we got last time we were here and comments we received during the public comment period. So in terms of implementation, that's covered in section 4 of the plan. It's pretty similar to other plans we've developed in other areas. The trustees, the federal trustee and state will work separately, but will coordinate closely on implementing different components. And like I mentioned before, we plan to work on partners very closely. We do this on pretty much every project. We rely on our partners very heavily. So we can only do so much by ourselves. We really rely on the community, sportsmen's groups, things like that to get stuff done. And as part of the implementation section, we always have a discussion about monitoring. We want to make sure that these restoration actions, recreation projects are meeting the goals that we set out for. So what's next? Well, we're here presenting to you our draft restoration plan in hopes that we get lots of public comment. And the way that folks can comment is by sending submissions via email or snail mail. Submissions are due on June 11th. And we just ask that you put Bridger Pipeline 2015 Yellowstone River Oil Spill Draft Restoration Plan in the subject line. Just to reiterate, this is how you can participate right here. Don't hesitate to contact Doug, Brian, and myself with questions, and we're happy to answer any questions while we're here. That's why we're here. That's all we've got to present to you today. We're happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that folks have. Again, we just ask that you say your name, and if you want to say who you're affiliated with, we're happy to hear that too.
My comment, Dennis German, always moving. And you touched on it in the previous slide about the DC local input too. So if local sportsman groups are ever going to be part of the planning committee or your boat ramp side of it, would that be part of the engineering plans or what? You want to try and say here? Say, do the design fish the boat ramp.
Mm-hmm.
Is a couple of us from local working groups be part of that planning, engineering and stuff like that?
Yes, we would be looking to Lies Unlimited and the community as a whole for input on what would they like to see at that site.
Instead of coming here and saying.
Yeah, we came from Helen, and like I said, we need to hear from you guys what it is that you want to see out on the ground.
This is Dave Flynn with Lies Unlimited, and I was the drafter of the formal submittal for the boat ramp project. And I'm glad to see we've got Frank Steen from the city here as well. But I believe we're very supportive of either option 3 or 4. I think it would satisfy our primary flows what we'd like to see. You know, I know when we talked before, you know, the fish restoration, a lot of us are fishermen, you know, are looking at anything that would help improve the fishery. The channel complexity at 890,000 spent on the lower river, you know, it's hard to quantify what projects are really being done with those dollars. And, you know, if you've been around here during ice out or high river flows, this stretch of Yellowstone River to try to actually do anything to it that's sustainable. So I question certain channel complexity and certain type of projects from the cost effectiveness or whatever you do, will it last? I mean, if you run this river year to year, the channel that's here, the hole that's there, every year changes and when the water goes clear. So I know those type of projects have been successful on some other rivers and drainages, but especially on this lower section of river. And, you know, I'm not a hydrologist, I'm not a biologist, but I know what that river does, and I can just see some back channels on islands. We've seen some years they're slowing it, some years they're not. But you can go to try to correct it, and next year Mother Nature is going to say, haha, we filled that in with silt. The channel moved 100 yards over the other side of the river. So that's just a comment. You know, some of the other things that you think you can do upriver that will improve the fishery, I think would be highly supported. But money spent trying to modify the channel, at least in this section, over seems like there's enough common sense to some of this.
I guess I'd like to hear your response too, Doug, but as you were saying that, you're right that $890,000, although it's a chunk of change on a river this size, it's really likely left part of it. The one comment I have is one thing we've been working on as a program with some of our other restoration plans is trying to use our funds to leverage outside as much as possible. So if there's opportunities to do that, we'd really like to pursue that, whatever that means. But I completely agree with you. Thank you. Anybody online have any comments, Doug?
Yeah, one more, if I was starting again, what's the timeline of some of this, say, alternative flow, but when you plan on instituting this and people surveying and
Sure. This is Doug Martin, with the Natural Resource Damage Program. So our hope, both the state and the Fish and Wildlife Service, is to, you know, once this public comment period closes on June 11th, we have to review the comments that we get and consider how they might modify the restoration plan or not. And then we will propose a final restoration plan to our trustees for the state side, that is the governor, and for Brian and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it's the Secretary of Interior. So we will propose that to them. We did meet with the governor's office just earlier this week and updated him where we are here, with the hopes that you know, we will get a restoration plan that will be signed by the governor and the secretary sometime this summer. As soon as that happens, those funds are already in a state account and can be, as far as the boat ramp goes, we can start putting those to work. So we do have engineers. Most of the way the state, the way we implement these projects is the funds are held by the Bureau of Investments. And they invest those funds, so they actually grow a little bit. And then we will allocate those funds. So in this case, we would work with you guys on whether or not, you know, how we'd want to develop this fishing access site or do the improvements to it, or work with the city. If the city wanted to take the lead, we could set up a contract with the city so that they could hire the engineer and go through that process. If that was not the case, we have engineers, that we have under contract that we could hire, that could come or that are here or whatever, and work with the city and Trout on, or Walleyes Unlimited and others, and work out a plan that meets what your guys' objectives are. So we have flexibility on how we move that. Knowing, if this gets approved sometime this summer, we could probably start that planning process, later in the summer and the fall, and potentially, we have built stuff on the Yellowstone in the Billings area, and you're either building it before high water or after high water. So I would suspect we probably wouldn't have any shovels on the ground until 2024. There might be some smaller things. I know when we were here last time, we did drive down there and look at that area. For instance, if you wanted to upgrade, or put in an outhouse or something like that, something like that might be able to get in 2023, but, just by the time you get through that planning process, and it's 2024 before we get on the ground. I'm not sure about Brian's stuff, but Brian's same time.
If easements do for them, do it.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of, permitting, lots of other factors that will still things.
During St. City one that, I think the easement is actually secured. I can give it to you if you need anything. We're also going through, the city is going through the city and county process. We're going through a process right now for the 205 study for the floodplain issues that we have. So the hydrology studies like that have, they're actually complete. So we can get you that information stuff on the website. And how do you work with the Army Corps? I mean, anything touched the river, you're far away, right?
Yep. So we have to go through the permitting process.
Okay.
So
There's a length right there.
yeah. So we don't have.
Yeah, I mean, you're lucky. That's 25.
Yeah. So there are other programs, that we do work with if it's associated with, for instance, a Superfund site. They're exempt from some of that permitting. But we're not. We don't fall under that.
The only thing they do fast is move slow.
I mean, I definitely, I lean toward 3 though, really, because of exactly what Dave brought up, the issues with the changing river, and we are in an odd spot here. I mean, this dam that they put out here, a lot of people call it the interstate. But it creates an ice jam problem for the city of Dundas in Dawson County, and it really, I think the river, and I've gone through it a lot, it changes month to month. And so spending money on river, fish habitat and the river restoration. And that's, you did bring up the project on the Tongue River, right? So that's within range of doing a project here. I think the community around here and stuff would rather see that money put into something around here instead of the Tongue River. I mean, I think we all understand what's, we want to do what's best for the fishermen, long-term stuff, so we understand the benefit of doing a project like that. But the recreation aspect of this does bring a long-lasting implementation to the, something to the plan that actually, that's going to last, that's going to be there, and that's going to be more by the residents of Dundas and Dawson County. So, I mean, I really like that. I understand there's more to it. But.
Yeah, this is Doug again. So I would ask you to put that, if you want to submit that as a comment, this is, we are recording this meeting, but it's not we're not taking public comment at this meeting. So if you want, that's what I'm trying to think. So if you want that submitted for our consideration, if you would submit that, that'd be greatly appreciated.
Okay, so another question. So the fish habitat action that you are considering in number 4, would that be on the Tongue River?
Essentially, we would work with FWP to prioritize, you guys to help prioritize fish habitat projects, and let FWP tell us what are the priority projects, how can we best spend those funds.
So if, we're supporting one over another, would we have to wait to make the decision on the alternative we support to find out what fishing habitat actions be implemented under that alternative?
That's a good question. Right now, there's a list of ideas out there, and I don't think we have a real good idea of how feasible they are, or what their priorities are, and that might be valuable to evaluate.
Well, I just think that that'd be good information to have, because I think that would be some people to pick another alternative over it, and
There are some examples in the restoration,
Is there?
there are specific examples of the diversion that have been brought up. That doesn't mean those are the only projects that we might work on, so it is a good question.
thank you. This is, go ahead.
Well, Mark Kapfer, Walleyes Unlimited, so, when one of Dave Lynn's comments about, trying to do some changes in channels, I fully understand that and agree with that. But also on the recreation, I didn't even understand the project that right at the boat end of Glendive. What would the remainder of those funds be used for? Do you have any ideas? Or is it kind of like your fish habitat that's kind of out there waiting to be finalized?
We would be looking for input on where to spend those funds and where the priorities and where the opportunities are.
So those aren't. There's nothing concrete there.
Yeah, to be blunt, the most concrete thing we have now is the Glendive site, and beyond that, we're just talking about where we can put money the best.
And one of the things that we do, and Nathan talked about a little bit, is that, to make these dollars go further, so it's a settlement. There's never enough restoration dollars to fix all the problems or all the issues, because it was a settlement. But leveraging matching funds, so if we work on the Glendive, the local fishing access site, and we can work with you guys or others to bring in other matching funds to help complete that project, that means there's going to be more dollars left over to maybe go to another fishing access site that needs some additional improvement somewhere else. So we can stretch those dollars further, and those decisions can be made. The restoration plan is written such that we can, go to different sites. We haven't tied ourselves in so tightly that we can't, if we do have extra dollars, to go to those other sites to work on those as well. That's some flexibility that we've learned is valuable in the process, because it works well.
I know there's other funds that, and I can't remember the project that, where they're trying to create more access sites. Is there any coordination between this project and those projects to create more access?
There is, yes, when we were developing this restoration plan, we did look at that, those documents, and those fit with this, and yes, we will coordinate or are coordinating with those folks, and additionally talking with Fish, Wildlife and Parks about where there might be additional needs, in the broader sense. So that's the benefit of the way we have tried to draft this, is so that we can try to work with as many folks as we can and leverage as much money, because the settlement is limited. It was $2 million. It's not like there was a fishing access site on the Yellowstone River. It's not cheap to build if you want it to be there for very long. So we have allocated what we feel is enough money. We've built several of them in the Billings area, or worked with Fish, Wildlife and Parks on improving some of those. So we had a good idea of the potential costs. So.
What is the cost?
What's that?
What is the cost of the boat rentals?
It was less than the 500 that we put here. But those, there was one of those actually had land acquisition with it as well. So that was, that adds a lot to the time frame and the cost. But as you guys know, just building something on the banks of the Yellowstone is a lot needs to be a lot more than, where Nathan and I do, a lot of our work is on the Clark Fork on the west side of the divide. And, it doesn't move the material that this river out here moves and, yeah, you guys got an impressive body of water.
And it's not my opinion, there was a 30-inch diameter conduit going down past the river as it was there.
Yeah,
It went one. I pulled in my vehicle and got you a picture.
yeah, no, I during the 2011 spill and Billings, you see some of that same stuff, and yeah, it's impressive.
We'll follow up on that. This is Brian McDaniel, Walleyes. A couple more questions about fishing access sites. You mentioned, I was kind of wondering the same thing, kind of a greenfield cost for a new site. Is that something that you guys have pinpointed or looked at specific sites upriver? I know in the draft plan, it kind of went into a little more detail on sites upstream from here. Is that something you can co-share or work with the NRDP on? Would that be public access or, but that's kind of out of our wheelhouse. We do what we can here, but knowing that's also a component of one of those alternatives, is that something that they've already identified as a potential area and have suggestions or, ideas on moving forward with?
Yeah, all the specific examples that are in the plan, we got from FWP. So I think Mike is still on on that, but I know he's got a list of potential areas that we could do these sort of projects. And some of them are in private lands, some of them are on public land.
Well, I think one of our concerns with one of those alternatives is that, like you said, 475,000 we rolled a long ways, and if that gets shared or split down, halved out for our existing program, and yet another new one, how much do we really have?
So yeah, so the message we heard, and not only from, at the scoping meeting, and also with our conversations with Fish, Wildlife and Parks, is that they do believe that this one here should be the priority, the one in town, and that we should work with you folks to help make sure that is developed, and if that's where we ultimately are going, it's still a draft plan, so we can't guarantee that, but we were, basically we would be working with you folks to work on the highest priority one, which we've heard is this one right here. So that's the, right now, the 100 or the 400, all those funds would be focused on that. If all those funds were focused on that and it took those, if that's what it took, that's what those funds would be.
One last comment / question for the ones who weren't here last time is the restoration money is spent in full or earnest. There's no left over for me. Yes, it's frankly, when we were going through that scoping, the money would be available to us now, but not, 4 or 5 years down the road.
So in some cases, we have allocated funding to initiate O&M or operation and maintenance. Typically, what we have done is limited it to a short period of time, 5 years, something like that. So that, in this case, that boat ramp could get up and be operated and there'd be maintenance to maintain it. It is also very clear from the governor's office is that if this is the road we're going to take, they are going to want to see that there is local support to help maintain this into the future. We don't, the part of the monitoring is that when we do implement a project, we want to make sure that in our criteria are, what's the cost effectiveness, what's the long-term effectiveness of these projects. So we monitor it to make sure that they're meeting those criteria in years to come. So it's the same thing with the recreational facilities. We don't want to build a recreational trail or in this case, a fishing access site, and there's no local support for it. public local support and also financial local support to maintain that into the future. That is one thing that this governor's office has made clear, that they do want to see that there is a local commitment to, maintaining these things into the future. So that would be a good thing to add to your public comment if you have that. So,
Because, we have been maintaining this and putting the gravel in, always moving and maintaining this one, that's what Brian brought up, about maintenance dollars afterwards, that, always having gravel, gets washed, and we haven't had. Concrete sometimes, just constant maintenance.
right.
But we're limited, so if we put forth what we can. We don't wanna buy a yacht and not be able to change oil. And, that's just stuff that I've been thinking about, because I think in the first one, you guys mentioned that it was limited on O&M as far as maintenance money goes, so.
Yeah, because
I
these,
think you fully have the support.
Yeah.
Just financial backing is.
Right.
fairly limited.
and one of the main goals of these funds, both for the state and the Fish and Wildlife Service, is to put those dollars on the ground. Is to expend them. We're not, we are not putting them into the Bureau of Investments to build a trust. Our goal is to put them on the ground and put those dollars to work to restore or replace those services, injured resources.
So I have a question for basically our city engineer. So you said you were looking at easements and so, so you're working on easements, so who is actually, on all the line? Is there gonna be?
Well, we're not working on easements, but we have a pretty good.
I don't know.
This.
That is, right, so,
Yeah, that's there. And so like, we own the property is actually.
so that goes to the
So
city,
yeah, so
then
the O&M, a lot of the O&M would fall under the city.
that was the question.
Yeah, so.
Right, okay, a lot of that.
I figured that's where you're going.
Yep, yes.
So that kind of documentation and comment and support would be beneficial.
I found, when I talked, after I talked. Just gotta find it in the other files.
So are there any other comments about the plan specifically? I mean, if we want to talk about implementation or where we might want to go with that, I think we could end the meeting and stop the recording and have some conversations. I don't think we need to record all this. Yeah. Are there anybody else have any questions here on the plan? How about online? Does anybody have any comments or questions online? Nope. Okay. Well, with that, we'll end the PowerPoint here and our streaming over the World Wide Web, and we can stick around and chat casually if you'd like to. Yeah, you have to shut off the.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in online. We're signing off. Thanks, Sydney.